And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shawn Ginwright, who is a Jerome T. Murphy Professor of Practice at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where his work focuses on trauma healing and empowering African American youth, with an acute focus on the challenges faced by urban youth in navigating poverty and striving for equality and justice. Are you okay if I pause from this real quick and talk about, all right, so listen, Dr. Ginwright comes out of the Bay Area, where he has worked with young people facing barriers in life and developed youth workers and supported them with an agenda that actually makes a difference in their lives. I am so excited to have Dr. Ginwright here with us today because his book, The Four Pivots, which I believe you should be able to purchase while you're here today from one of the QR codes we have in the back, had a remarkable impact on me. This idea that if our work is to reimagine justice, a structural system that administers justice in our society, in order to be really good at that, we also need to reimagine ourselves. Amen? Or okay? If we are going to have tools like a consent decree and other things in place, those tools are only as good as the people using them. And we are the people that need to be prepared to use that. And that is the mission of the MNJRC, is to equip you with those tools. Sometimes the radical brother in me wants to call them weapons. And so I'm excited to bring Dr. Ginwright to the stage today to share with us his perspective on the four pivots and how we can move from problems to possibilities. Please give a warm round of applause for Dr. Shawn Ginwright. Thank you.
It is an honor and pleasure to be here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. MNJRC, thank you for the invitation, Justin. I know it took us a while, man, to get this together and for me to get here, but it is an honor and a pleasure for me to be able to be here and share these ideas with you. From problem to possibility, and I know the state of Minnesota is, as in Oakland, has experienced lots of challenges and problems in relationship to creating justice. And I hope that the ideas that I share with you are not so much about the strategies, the techniques, the base building, the power building, all the things that we know is important to create justice, but I hope that the ideas that I share with you feed your soul, because we know that the systems and the work for justice sometimes drains us. But this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. And it isn't until we come into community, we learn to discover ourselves and who we are together that we can actually create true justice in our communities and our neighborhoods. So I just want to say that there's a lot of challenges that we're facing, and there's significant challenges that we will stay before us. And I believe that our journey for justice, those of us who love justice, those of us who have committed our lives to freedom and justice and for our communities, we have a different path, a different challenge before us. The challenge that we have before us is not just a political challenge, and it's not just a tactical or a technical challenge. The challenge that we have before us is essentially a spiritual challenge. That if we continue to believe that the answers, that we believe that we could solve political problems or we could solve spiritual problems with technical solutions, we'll continue to reproduce these things. If we believe that we could solve spiritual problems with technical techniques, that we will continue to reproduce the kind of challenges that we see in our neighborhoods and communities. So we need a different path. And not to say that the work that we do that's technical, the legal work, the organized, not to dismiss that at all, but it's half of the equation, y'all. And so I hope that the ideas that I share with you, that I put in the book, helps us with the soul fuel, right? The fuel that actually matters in our long journey for justice. I want to start with, I always like to start with a story, so I'm going to start with this story, and some of you may have heard the story before, so forgive me, but I think the story sort of situates us where we are and guides us to where we need to be. It's actually a story about my mama. And my mama, she grew up in a small town outside of Gainesville, Florida, a place called Trenton. And as a child, I grew up outside of LA. My mama used to tell me and my brothers, I have two brothers, about her magical stories of growing up in Trenton, Florida, in this little beautiful house near a creek. And so as a child, me and my brothers would love those stories when she would tell us about this beautiful little house, and she would go into the backyard and climb the tree and pick fresh mangoes and eat fresh mangoes. And my mama used to tell us about the creek, and in the evening in this creek, you would see these little bugs that would float above and they would glow in the dark. And me and my brothers were so excited when she would tell us these stories. And deep down inside, I really wanted to see that house one day. It was about 8 or 9 years ago, my uncle passed away in Trenton, Florida, and my mama, she called me on the phone and she said, Shawn, your uncle passed away. I'm going to the funeral in Trenton and I'd love for you to come with me. And I said, Mama, I got papers to grade, grants to write, I got stuff to do, I don't know if I can make it. And my mama, she did what y'all mamas probably do. My mama said, boy, get your narrow butt on this plane and come to Trenton. So I'm a good son, so I got on the plane and went to Trenton. And deep down inside, I still really wanted to see this little house that my mother had always shared with me and my brothers. And so I went to Trenton, Florida, and I'm glad I did. And I got there, my mama was, she's so proud. Oh, my son, the doctor. And so she took me to all my cousins' house that I hadn't seen in years. And we sat on my first cousin's house. We sat on the couch, the couches with them plastic covers, right? Some of y'all still got them plastic covers, and it's all right. So we sat on the couches and we drank lemonade and we told stories, and we got late in the day and we kept going to cousin after cousin's house. I'm like, Mama, I really want to come see, I want to see that house. Can you show me the house that you grew up in? And she said, okay, baby. So we left the final cousin's house and we walked out onto the street. And we made a left-hand turn onto a dirt road. And I'll never forget, the dirt road was canopied by, I don't know if you've ever been to the South before, but the trees, they dripped with moss, and it was deeply enchanting. As we walked in silence, it was late in the day and the sun was setting. We just walked in silence. And as we walked, I became more and more excited to see this house, this magical little house that my mama had always told us about. As we got closer, I looked to the left and I saw for sure there was this little creek, and I could see the little lightning bugs bouncing above the water. I got so excited like a kid. And so I said, Mama, where's the house? And she said, we're here. And when I turned to see the house, I almost started to cry because it wasn't what I had imagined. Can somebody advance the slides? This is the house that I saw. It wasn't the house of my imagination. It was actually a shed, a shack. And it was for the first time I realized how poor my mama had grown. She had never told me and my brothers about her poverty. And I was overwhelmed by that. And my mama she saw something entirely different. Y'all, I don't know how to explain this, but my mama, when she saw the house, she was excited. And she took my hand and she walked me into the house like she was a child, like she was at Disneyland. And she took me to one little corner. It was just a one little room shack. She took me to the corner and she said, see, baby, this is where we used to keep the number 10 tub. And just like y'all, I scratched my head. I was like, what's a number 10 tub? And number 10, she said the number 10 tub is a big metal tub where we used to take baths, because see, we didn't have running water. We would boil the water and let it heat up, and this is where we would bathe. And she took me to the other corner, and this is where we keep the pot-belly stove. And as she began to share all of the nooks and crannies of that house, I became deeply, deeply just overwhelmed with emotion. I began to cry. I was like, Mama, dang, I didn't know you had grown up in such poverty. You never told me this. And she must have sensed something, because she saw me crying and she came up to me and looked up at me And she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Boy, why are you crying?" I said, "Mama, I just didn't know. You grew up with such poverty." And she said, "Boy, I want you to know something. When I was a child, I dreamed of you before you even existed in this house. And for you to come back to this place is a realization of my dream, so you should be rejoicing and not sad." And it was at that moment that I realized something profound lesson that my mama had taught me. She said, I realized that she understood poverty, but she wasn't defined by it. I realized that she understood the conditions that she was in, but she was not defined by it. Y'all hear me? That she was able to see me through, beyond, and above the conditions that she was in. She never forgot and she never let go of her dream of me, which is why I'm standing here today. I think that this is the lesson that we have before us as justice warriors. I think that is the lesson that we have before us for those of us who love justice, is how might we and how do we see, understand the condition that we're in, but not be defined by it, y'all. It means that we have to figure out how to shift our fear to freedom. We have to learn how to shift our sense of despair to joy. We have to learn how to not focus a future of dystopia, but see a future of delight. This is what we have to do. And I hope that the ideas in this book, the 4 pivots, gives us the fuel, gives us the permission, and gives us the capacity to do that. I wrote the 4 pivots because I really wrote it for myself. And I feel like I'm at home, Justin, so I'm gonna just tell the truth, man. I'm not gonna do the canned speech tonight, all right? I'm gonna tell the truth, y'all. I've been working for justice for my whole life, and you know, I lost dear friends to this movement. Friends that got sick and we didn't give them time to rest. Friends that had mental health issues, but we told them to keep on struggling because you're a soldier. Y'all feel me? Friends that decided that they couldn't do it no more because they were hiding behind their work, but they couldn't take care of their own family. So I wrote this book mostly for me because I needed to understand what I wish I had this when I was younger. Permission to dream, permission to see possibility, permission to understand the importance of rest. And so I wrote this, and I call them pivots because change is hard. If I wrote a book, the 4 things you gotta change, wouldn't nobody read that? Right, y'all know, change is hard. Change means you gotta do something different in your behavior. It means you gotta stop doing one thing and do another. And so I call them pivots because a pivot is subtle. It means you don't have to stop what you're doing. It just means that if you're going in this direction and you just pivot a little bit, then you're gonna go in this direction. And that little subtle pivot you'll be in a totally different end place than if you had not made that subtle change. And that subtle change makes a difference. Collectively, it makes a difference when we do it together. Okay, thank you. So these 4 pivots are woven together. That means that we have to think about them as they reinforce one another. And the first pivot that I talk about in the book is a pivot from lens to mirror. And a pivot from lens to mirror just means that how is it that we think deeply and reflect on ourselves and our journey? How is it that we think about our own wounds and our own insecurities in this work for justice? I know I was trained as a sociologist at UC Berkeley. And as a sociologist, I was given all the theories, all the techniques, all the strategies, all the things. I could explain to you why black youth are suspended, why black youth experience violence, why there's disproportionate funding, and I could explain all of the conditions in chocolate cities in this country. But what I couldn't explain is the first time a young man came to me and said his brother was shot. And what that felt for me, and how that shifted me. I didn't learn that in graduate school. What am I supposed to say to his mama? I didn't learn that in graduate school. What am I supposed to say to him? I didn't learn that in graduate school. So their reflection, the mirror work that I call, requires us to do some deep reflection, some gut check about our own insecurities, about the things that matter for us. I remember and I recall working with a group of organizers who were trying to work with these black boys and trying to mend the relationships with their fathers. And I asked them a simple question: what's the relationship you have with your daddy? And many of them got offended because, you see, they hadn't talked to their own daddy in a year, or their daddies had abandoned, and they had a resentment. And so they weren't when they did the mirror work, they were hiding behind their work. The real work was the work that they needed to do to reconcile the relationships with their parents. But mirror work is harder than lens work because it implicates us. It makes us ask questions about our own insecurities and the things that we need to heal from. And sometimes in justice work, we say that ain't the real work. But how can we heal others if we still wounded, y'all? How can we heal our community if we still hurting? And so it's the capacity for us to ask ourselves these questions, to ask our communities these questions, and actually do reflection, mirror work for our institutions. These are more difficult questions than they are when we just sort of do analysis questions, that this is the challenge out there. Everything else gotta change. They gotta change. The funding's gotta change. The policy's gotta change. But we have to change. About 10 years ago, I decided I'm not gonna do any more man, you gotta give me a little time, man. I'm sorry, I just feel like talking right now. So I gotta, y'all, somebody give me a time, because I feel like talking. I just feel like talking. No, I'm gonna keep it tight. I'm gonna keep it tight. I promise. About 8 years ago, I was doing some DEI work. You know, folks say, hey, can you come in, Dr. Ginwright, and do some DEI work and help our organization and our school system change? And I went in there and I was doing all the things and looking at the policies, and they changed everything. But the people still didn't love the babies. And they were scratching their head, but the people didn't. The people still use the language like bad kids. The policy changed, but the people didn't, because they hadn't done the real work about the values that they hold of black and brown communities. Y'all feel me? So mirror work is an important part of how we do this, and the hardest look is inward. And we could do that individually, and we could do that with our organizations. But most of us think about mirror work like this, right? How am I supposed to lose weight if everything tastes good? In other words, I ain't got no control over mirror work, right? This is how we think about reflection. That it's hard to do, and I can't do that because I got too many other things to do. Y'all feel me? But it is one of the most important pieces of this journey. The second pivot is a pivot from transactional to transformative relationships. And we know what transactional relationships are. These are relationships that are a function of our titles, right? These are the things that we do, the titles that we keep. These relationships are efficient, but they're not effective for deep change. Transformative relationship says, I'm the boss, you're the employee. I'm the teacher, you're the student. And while those things are efficient, it doesn't call into the human qualities that are necessary for deep change. What are the human qualities? Human qualities are vulnerability. Human qualities are storytelling. When I just told that story about my mama, y'all know me a little bit differently. So when we tell our stories, those stories are a portal to our humanity. And when we connect with our humanity, we form a bond of empathy and connection that's unbreakable. And so transformative relationships are significant and important as we move towards move in this journey for justice. When I interviewed for this book, I talked to Pastor Ben McBride, and he was explaining to me that a lot of times what we do is that when something happens in our neighborhoods, in our communities, we ask ourselves the first wrong question. And when we ask the first wrong question is, what do we need to do? What is it I need to do to fix this? And he says, that's the wrong question, but the first right question is, who do I need to become? Because Ben says that sometimes we can't achieve the goals we want. Listen to me now. We can't achieve the goals we want in the current versions of ourselves. We can't achieve the goals we envision in the current version of ourselves because oppression and suffering has shaped our capacity to even see beyond it. So Ben says we have to do some inner work. We have to transform our relationships with ourselves and others in order for us to actually become and do the thing that's important for justice. The third pivot, of course, the theme of this conference, is a pivot from problem to possibility, right? And when we think about this pivot from problem to possibility, we understand that the conditions that we're living in, the conditions that we're facing, sometimes feels like that we're on a treadmill, that we're always responding to crisis after problem after problem, after challenge after challenge. And while we need to address problems, that is only half of our responsibility as leaders. Now, I'll say it again. Solving problems is only half of our responsibility as leaders. Because if we only solve problems, then we're never open to building the muscle of what my mama did, is being able to see into a possible future. The way that oppression works, y'all, is it tells us, it shapes us, and it tells us that you cannot see beyond oppression. That's what it does. It says, you cannot see beyond me. So the greatest thing you could do as a justice warrior, what oppression says, is you can reduce misery. This is why oftentimes we think about the reduction of misery as victory. We call, for example, the absence of illness doesn't constitute health. Just like the absence of violence doesn't constitute peace. And so this sometimes what we do is we think we call the reduction in violence a victory. And while that's a necessary precondition, what we really want is peace. And so we have to think differently about how we engage in the language that we use to create justice. And the ways in which oppression shapes us is we have to really think and sort of go against that. And so this notion of possibility, this notion of radical dreaming, as Robin Kelly shares with us, is hard work. How many of you know what this is? See that picture? It's hard work. So how many of you know what this is? Raise your hand real quick if you know what this is. So y'all, okay, you know what this is. Sometimes I do this with younger crews, they don't know what this is. So for the young folks in here, this is called an arcade. And we used to have to go to play the games. You have to put quarters on these machines and we would play them, right? So if you know what this is, what was your favorite arcade game? At your table, quickly, what was your favorite arcade game? At your table. Okay, by round of applause, Pac-Man. Round of applause, Miss Pac-Man. Round of applause, Galaxia? No, Galaxia? Asteroids. Couple more, Donkey Kong. All right, we got a few, all right, so Pac-Man wins. So there was this game called Whack-A-Mole, y'all remember that? So whack-a-mole, right? So how much of our lives sometimes feel like whack-a-mole? that when we focus on problems, right, it feels like we're playing a persistent, consistent game of whack-a-mole. One problem props up, we knock it down, we knock it down. This is what problem-focused work does. That the years before us and this new terrain that we have at the federal government, there's gonna be problems, and we need to knock those down, but we also have to do what my mama did. We have to see the possibilities, and how do we do that? That means we have to have constant and intentional conversations about dreaming. What do we dream about for our communities? What do I dream about for my life? What do I dream about for my neighborhood? What do I dream about for this organization? We have to use those words consistently and persistently to counteract this focus on problem. The next pivot. Oh, this is a story I wanted to share with you. Sorry about that. So I was doing, as Justin said, I was doing work in Oakland. Most of my work in Oakland is working with African-American young people. And I happened to be working with a group of African-American young men, all of which who experienced trauma. This is probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And these young men all had different types of trauma, right? Some of them were unhoused. Some of them had experienced violence. Some of them had committed violence. And they were in this trauma-informed circle. And every Thursday night, we would meet at the community college in plastic chairs, and I would buy pizza. And my goal was to help them understand that the challenge or the problem or the trauma that they experienced helped shape their behavior. And so every Thursday night, we would kind of talk about the worst thing that ever happened to them. And so one Thursday night, this young man came up, we were all in a circle, and he said, Dr. G, man, you know what, bro, man, we like coming here on Thursday nights. It's cool, but why we always got to talk about the worst thing that ever happened to us? I'm more than just my trauma, man. I want to actually open up my own clothing store. And when he said that, I thought he was joking. But then the other young man chimed in. He said, "Yeah, man, I want to create my own radio. My own podcast." And each one by one began to talk about their dreams, not their trauma. We all were going around, and it went to this one young man, John. And to be honest with you, John was, when it got to him, John was high in the circle, right? In the healing circle. He was high that night. And so John said, Dr. G, man, I don't really want to create my own business. I don't really want to do none of this. I don't want to create nothing. What I really want to do, Dr. G, is, man, I want to be a firefighter, man. I just want to have a family, be a firefighter here in Oakland. Now, remember, he was high when he said that. So all the other young men was like, come on, Sean, please, bro. Why don't you just lower your expectations? And I was like, everybody, hey, let John have his dream. And even me, I was like, John, man, you got a long way to go, man. But everybody, and John, I could see him kind of pull his shoulders back. He said, no, man, I want to be a firefighter. So we continued to meet for about a year, and after that, I gave these young men my phone number, my cell phone number, and so we stopped meeting after about a year, and I gave those men my phone number, and from time to time, I'll receive a text message from them. And so about 2 years ago, I was leaving a conference, and sure enough, I got a text from one of the young men. It was John, the one that said he wanted to be a firefighter, the one that was high in the circle, the one that all the other young men was like, please, John, you're probably not gonna ever be a firefighter. The text said, Dr. G, how you doing? I said, John, it's good to hear from you, man. How you doing? And it paused, and the little thing to go do, 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 do. I was like, man, he typing a long message. And he didn't type a message. This is the image that I got back. That's John. So John, turns out that John went to a program that allowed him to become a paramedic. And then he learned from being a paramedic, he applied for the Oakland Fire Department. He has a beautiful family and his children. So our dreams matter. They matter more than the policy sometimes. They matter more, but the dreams and the opportunity to capture those dreams matter. The last pivot is a pivot from hustle to flow. A pivot from this ongoing addiction to frenzy that we have. I call it an addiction to frenzy because we believe that our addiction to frenzy feeds us, right? And we all have it. Like, how many of us in here, just raise your hand if you have a to-do list, right? We all got a to-do list. And what's the first thing you do when you finish something on your to-do list? You scratch it off and you put 3 more things back on there. So this ongoing task, thinking about accomplishing tasks, actually, it's not deep change for justice. That sometimes we have to actually pull back. Sometimes we actually have to take rest. Sometimes we have to slow down. But this capitalist culture that we're in, that values a human being by what a human being can earn or produce, suggests that we always have to be in the mode to be always producing and creating and accomplishing something. Not all societies believe that. And in our work for justice, this is also the case, that we sometimes believe we can achieve deep change quickly, right? Insta change, right? If we just do this, then we get change. If we just add water, we get change. But deep transformative change takes time. In the book, I actually introduce a concept that we rarely talk about, a form of inequality. We talk about racial inequality. We talk about gender inequality and income inequality. But this form of inequality, we rarely talk about. And it's rest inequality. The sort of inequality in the duration and the quality of our capacity to rest. And rest is not just slumber, but theoretically and in the research, rest is the time spent not having to think about work. And when we engage in rest, not just slumber, but gardening or the things that we do that brings us pleasure and joy, that allows us to have a different mindset so we can enter back into the work that's important and necessary. When I was about 4 or 5 years ago, I was engaged, I was getting ready to go do a keynote speech, and I was in frenzy, and I was at home by myself, and my wife had gone, and I was at home, we're empty nesters, so my kids were out of the house, and it was just me and my dog, and I was trying to hurry up and get through, prepared to catch a plane to get to my flight, when I saw my dog. Now this is gonna get a little graphic, y'all, but I feel like I'm at home. So I was in the shower, and my dog was like, I gotta go pee. And I'm like, dang, okay, I gotta hurry up. And so I jumped out of the shower, and I have a step down into my room, and I slipped, and I fell, and I went up, and boom, I came down on the stair, and my ribs hurt. I was like, oh my God. And I was in so much pain, and I couldn't move. And you guys, this is what I saw when I looked up. Like, now, my dog ain't Lassie. Y'all know Lassie? So my dog couldn't get help. And so it took me a long time. I crawled to my bed. I called you think I would call 911, but I called my wife. She said, what's wrong? She called 911. The ambulance broke in. They took me to the hospital. I had fractured 3 ribs and fractured a vertebrae, and I couldn't go anywhere. And the doctor said, you're not gonna go anywhere for 6 to 8 weeks. And that was the day before the world shut down. So everybody joined me, right? But during that time, I was forced to rest, but we all were forced to rest in a way. And that when we did that, we slowed down. We reconnected with ourselves. We took up hobbies. We began to recalibrate our relationship with time. And so this pivot to hustle to flow, and this pivot from problem to possibility, this pivot from transactional relationships to transformative relationships, pivot from lens to mirror, all woven together, allows us to have the possibilities to shift from problem to possibility. I want to end with this quote by Howard Thurman. As a researcher and who spent a lot of my life researching and trying to understand the conditions, I stopped reading some of the research and I began to read more spiritual text. And Howard Thurman is a spiritual prophet. And Dr. King read his book, and others have read his book. And he said, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and go do that. Because the world needs people who have come alive. And I think that we need to do that, find what comes alive for us to make this pivot from problem to possibility. Thank y'all so much, appreciate it. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, man.
Have a seat.
Right here.
Y'all better make a little bit more noise for Dr. Ginwright.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Ginwright. Y'all understand why we invited this brother to Minneapolis? Don't act confused. Y'all know this is exactly what we need to be talking about. It's my privilege now to welcome Dr. Yohuru Williams, who's going to lead a fireside chat, and we'll let them decide how they want to do questions and whatnot. But I see a lot of people taking notes. So, Dr. Williams serves on the MNJRC Research Advisory Board, where we have local academics and some not local advise and work with Dr. Remington Cunningham, which, by the way, Katie, you ain't got to stand up, but if everyone would just, today is her guest date. Everyone, please give Katie a round of applause. If she disappears by the end of the day, you'll know why. I'll let Dr. Williams from the University of St. Thomas take over the conversation from here. Just want to say thank you, brother, for being here, and thank you for all the work you do through the Over-Policed and Underprotected Project. And we'll let you get to it. Blessings.
Thanks, Justin. We want to get to questions and answers for all of you, but I would be remiss, Dr. G, if I didn't say that in listening to you, my brain burst, my system took on a new life, and I started to feel a sense of spirit around those 4 pivots that you talked about. If we had more time, I'd ask all of you to stand up and just practice what it feels like to pivot. Because one of the points that Dr. G made is that you're not talking about big movements. You're talking about small adjustments. Now, I want to be clear, some of us made the mistake on Friday evening of watching this prize fight. And it involved my hero, Mike Tyson, not because of the things he did in his personal life, but because he hasn't stopped dreaming. And many people thought it was a dream when he thought he could beat a younger Jake Paul. And the commentators kept saying during the fight, Mike wants to hit Jake Paul. His mind tells him what to do, but his legs just won't get him there. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm about to have this conversation with Dr. G. Can Mike pivot into this? But sometimes it's not about you doing the work entirely yourself. That's the point of the 4 pivots. Sometimes it's working in concert with other people who are helping to pivot that'll carry you to do the work, that'll help us transform the systems that we want to reimagine, reform, reinvest with a sense of humanity. So, Dr. G, I want to thank you for your work for that reason and get into a conversation with you about a couple of the really powerful points that you raised. We're coming up on a grim anniversary here in the Twin Cities in a few months, the 5-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. It's hard to believe that it's been or will be 5 years. In this moment, when you think about those 4 pivots, and particularly in terms of thinking about how many people are now frustrated because 5 years ago, there was tremendous promise. 5 years ago, there was momentum, and now that feels like it's waning. How can people reignite that sense of urgency and passion while still maintaining, particularly in this moment, a sense of mental clarity about the work?
Yeah, I think that, you know, over the past 5 years in Minnesota, but also throughout the country, right, that we've had the wind at our backs. And it felt good, right? And in some ways, I think it's lulled us into a way that an expectation that justice was inevitable, that justice, that it's just an inevitable outcome. And I think we're now entering a space where we have to call attention to the inner work that's necessary. You know, so our work for justice is always sort of dancing between the external and the internal, right? And I think at this particular time, it's critically important for us to focus on some of the internal so that we can actually create the external. And so I think that there should be sort of conversations about possibility. You know, we talk about possibility as an individual. Here's what I want, here's my dreams for myself. But how do we think about collective possibility, right? How do we actually think about bringing communities together to continue to have these conversations about dreaming and possibility, even in the context when it doesn't look possible. I think that's the sort of challenge that we have, is trying to keep the eyes on the prize, even in the midst of when we don't have the wind behind us. And that's really, really hard work, yeah.
Such a great point. I'm going to ask if you have questions to please raise your hand, and we have people out in the audience who will bring the microphone to you if they, oh, there they go. I was about to play Oprah here. Dr. G, I want to ask you this question because one of the most powerful things that you talked about today, but it's a theme with you, is whether it's possible to dream in an old house. A lot of us work in structures which feel like they're broken. And the question fundamentally for us, particularly when we're doing the work, is it possible to reimagine within this structure? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought about Isabel Wilkerson's book, Cast, where she says when you live in an old house, you become kind of nose blind to the challenges in that house. You know, and then they leach and they mutate and they get worse, and you assume no good can come of this. And yet you told this powerful story about how you can begin that process of dreaming and reimagining even in that old structure.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with a friend over dinner in Baltimore last week. And the conversation kind of went like this. He calls me G. G, how can we continue to dream the house being the America, right? He says, I'm not so sure I want to continue to invest here, and maybe, you know, we should do sort of a Marcus Garvey kind of a thing, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's true. I got that, right? I got that. But I'm not willing to abdicate my responsibility to my community, right? And just because it ain't easy don't mean I shouldn't do it, right? And it don't mean that don't mean that wherever you go it's going to be easy too. And so I think that we have to recognize, I think we have to have an awareness about how does that old house actually shape me. And sometimes what happens is when we get out of the house, I remember being at a conference and a woman came up to me after I talked and she said, I just got back from Bali or something. I can't remember where she said. No, Morocco, it was Morocco. I never really heard people go to Morocco. She said, I said, oh, why did you go to Morocco? Was it for vacation? She said, no, I went to Morocco so that I could breathe. I needed to breathe again, Dr. G. And I was gone for like a month, and now that the notion of breathing, I got what she felt, because sometimes the house constricts your breathing, right? So sometimes being able to sort of get out, to breathe again, so that we can actually come back to make the house better, to clean it up. And breathing doesn't have to be Morocco, right? It could just be going somewhere else, or physically just sort of retreating. It could be just deciding to take, I call them micro doses of healing. Not macro doses, but micro vitamin level doses of healing that we could take every day. What is a vitamin dose of healing? A vitamin dose is 5 minutes of reflection before you go to bed at night, right? A microdose is, I'm gonna take a walk today in a different way to reflect. A microdose is, I'm aware that I'm in frenzy, and I'm gonna choose not to be for 5 minutes. These are microdoses. It doesn't take a significant, like you ain't gotta go to Morocco, right? And so what I'm trying to encourage folks to do is to have some awareness about the ways in which this system and this environment shapes us, and make some conscious micro actions to actually add up over time to have a powerful impact.
Well, that microdoses is powerful. We have any questions right there? Can you state your name for us and please stand? Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Sarita. There we go. My name is Sarita Oduni, and I do have a question. Thank you for being here today. It's some community members in here that I know pretty well, and also my work family, and this is the question that we have, and you kind of already answered it. So we are like boots on the ground youth workers, and we work through the pandemic, and we're a little tired. But also what we're seeing that we're facing with our young people is this immense amount of hopelessness almost. Have never seen it in this capacity before. And we have, and this, I know this is kind of a country situation, but where we at, we got like the kids and, you know, there is some stuff going on. And we're looking like, how can we help? Where do we start? So the question that I have for you is, how do we begin to pivot our outlook just to be in community differently with these young people? And how do we also restore ourselves who are burnt out and kind of feel like we don't have any answers?
Yeah, great question. And you already told me you have is it the Northside Healing Center?
Yes, and 21st Century Academy.
And 21st Century Academy. So my response would be, well, what is your healing diet in your organization? Right? What is your healing diet in your organization? And if you go, oh, what is a healing diet? That means you ain't got one. That means, you know, usually in an organization, the healing diet is somebody got to get sick, and then they can go get well, or they can take sick time, or they can, you know, something bad got to happen. Illness has to happen in order for the organization to respond to the illness. So that's not a diet, right? And so a healing diet is like, well, what are the things that we have in place for the well-being of my staff? First, right? So that's first. We're gonna get to the young people. But like I said earlier, we can't heal, you know, how are you gonna heal somebody when we're still broken? And so a healing sort of diet may look like just regular, you know, before you start a meeting, before you go through the agenda, it might look like something, let's do an emotional check-in. Everybody, how are we feeling? What are you looking forward to most this month? Tell me something, a moment of delight that you had over the past 7 days. It's just a small thing that you do before you get into the agenda. The second thing is, do you have healing circles in your organization where once a week the staff comes along and you actually have a topic about healing and well-being, not about the work, but about the staff. I know that folks that are on the front lines oftentimes have the thinnest infrastructure for their own healing, but need it the most because of being out on the front line. So what is that infrastructure for organizations? And then for young people, hopelessness. So, you know, in my work, we created a summer camp. It's called Camp Akili for the hopelessness of Black young people in Oakland. And now we do it in Philadelphia. We're going to be doing it in Boston. But it is I don't know if this movie that you guys, this old movie called Field of Dreams, and there's this phrase that says, if you build it, they will come. And so that's kind of like what Camp Akili is. It's a 5-day camp it started with Black youth, now it's for young people of color, and it's a space for young people, for us to give them the hope again. And it begins with simple things like, well, one, we take them out of the city, and we have a beautiful place, and they stay, and, you know, they get scared because they see deer and squirrels and stuff. But again, coming out of the environment is an important part of being able to go back. But it starts with some simple things. Like, I remember the first time I worked with young people, and I asked a simple question, and this is simple for them. It was hard for them, but it's hard for you too. I asked them, tell me three things you most like about yourself. Now, that was really hard for them, just like it's hard for you. It's harder, it would be easier if I said, what are 3 things you want to change about yourself? Oh, you could boom, 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 boom. Only 3, Dr. G, right? That's because we're so used to focusing on the things that are broken in us, right? But conversations about assets, my point is the conversations about building assets about young people, having them discover what they bring and the assets that they bring is an important starting point for their own creating a sense of hope and belonging for them. I hope that helps. Mm-hmm.
Additional questions? You know, one of the things that's powerful, we got one right there. I'm going to ask this question while she's running to this brother. About this book is when you talk about this process of becoming, which is interesting because we don't think about it this way. In fact, I struggle with this a little bit because you're right, it's easy to look at the deficits. But becoming is all about practicing being a better mirror, which you said is the harder work. it also made me rethink some terms we use, like intervention as opposed to invitation. Like I want to intervene when I do something wrong instead of inviting reflection on how I might be not a better person, but better situated in the work and more comfortable in kind of taking on those inner voices or those challenges. Yeah. So why was it so important? And that's, for me, the most challenging part of the book, is this interplay between lens and mirror. What would be your advice in helping people calibrate that mirror?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the headline here is that the 4 pivots is not a silver bullet, y'all. Like, it's not like, I was having dinner with my family, my son and my daughter and my wife, and I have some challenges that happened with my mom and the family, and I was complaining because of Thanksgiving and going back and da-da-da, and I was complaining. I was like, my mom does this and da-da, my dad and that, and I was going on and on and on and on. My son stopped me and said, Dad, which pivot would you use right now? I was like, damn, really? And so the reason I share that is because it's a practice. It's like, we're not perfect. I wrote the book, and I don't practice them all the time, y'all. But it is having people who love us to hold us accountable to them that is important. And so when we do that, it's not like we just do it and we do the perfect pivots. It's not about that. It's about being committed to the journey of practice. That's why it's a practice. Sometimes we're gonna get it. Sometimes we'll get it right, and sometimes we don't. But it's committed to the journey of practice and not the perfection of the outcome. Does that make sense? And so my son reminded me, like, Dad, come on, man. Like, which one are you gonna use right now? He reflected back at me what I usually reflect at him. Like, I think, what's the possibility here, son? And so it's having the people accountable to your journey that are close to you, that you trust. I think that's so important. Not just reading the book and trying to do the things yourself, but having that community of support, I think, is critically important.
Appreciate that.
How you doing, Dr. G? My name is Darian.
Hey, Darian.
And I just wanted to kind of branch off of Sarita's question with kind of diving into the hopelessness further. I find that I deal with kids who have already been either in the justice system or been involved with the justice system. And I find that there's a lot of, it's different from when we were coming up. I came up in the streets as well. So I can relate to a lot of what my youth go through. But when it comes down to the aspect of caring, I find that aspect has kind of left a little bit as generations have gone on. I cared about what happened to my household, what happened to my mom, what happened, in the schooling realm, if I was going to pass. I find that there's a lot of lack of motivation as well with the hopelessness, lack of care. Where it's like, I'll commit an action. Back in the day, I wouldn't commit an action if I knew it was gonna reflect on my household. Now it's, all right, everybody for themselves. I'm gone, but this person who's against me knows exactly where I live. And I could tell you right now, Darian, I don't care. That type of stuff is coming up more often, where like, along with that hopelessness that she discussed, there's the lack of care, even for their own communities, their own families. And I don't really know how to break through that gap because it branches beyond my capacity. How do you kind of get to that point where you give them motivation, I guess is the word, but an understanding of what it is to care, during this time?
Yeah, it's a powerful question, and I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Just let you know, I don't have a good answer to that. The condition is that, young people have lost hope in themselves because society has turned them back on them, right? And so why should I care about this when the systems don't care for me? And so the sort of epidemic of not caring, of nihilism, of I don't care about myself, so why should I care about anything else, right? That is what Alvin Poussant, psychologists, call slow suicide, right? When there is this consistent, ongoing, risky behavior without concern that ultimately leads to death, right? And so, my own experience, man, is that you have to start with what is the wounds that are causing hopelessness, right? What are those wounds there? And how do you heal those wounds? And giving young people the tools, let me just give you one practical thing, man. Like, I know it's basic, but it matters in my work with young people. So I found that, like, when I'm working with, like, these young men I was working with, and I'm trying to get them to talk about their emotions, and I realized, what's your name, Darian? Man, I realized that I thought they just didn't want to because it was too painful, but they actually couldn't. They were not literate. They were emotionally illiterate, that they literally couldn't say, I'm fearful, or I'm disappointed, or I'm, right? They just couldn't, and I'm like, it's not that they don't want to, it's that they can't name the thing in there. And if you can't name the thing in there, it stay in there, y'all. So it comes out as, I'm cool, I'm all right, I'm good. Right? I'm cool, I'm all right, I'm good. When in fact, I'm hurt, I'm ashamed. That's actually what's in there. So my first thing was, I gotta provide some basic level of emotional literacy. So that means that I have to actually be intentional about like when I talk to these young men, I have to start being emotionally literate. Like I'm feeling a little insecure right now because, or I have some shame because this thing happened. Y'all, you feel me? And so me mirroring and trying to actually be emotionally literate gave them the permission, one, to find some emotional literacy, and then two, begin to introduce terms that they can name the damn thing that's in them. And when you can name the damn thing that's there, it actually comes out. You can put it out on the table and look at it. But as long as it stays in there, man, you know, what I always hear about relationship with their daddy, man, F my daddy. But that's not really what it is. It's, man, I'm sad. I'm hurting. Man, he left me. I feel abandoned. Those are terms that's there, but being able to get them to say it, right? And that takes time and patience. And it takes us working on ourselves so we could talk about that relationship. Like it's gonna be, I'm sorry, y'all, I'm just taking too much time here, but you being able to say that about your relationships with your folks to them and not be the professional, you know, whatever. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, bro, but I'm saying like when you are real with them and are able to name that thing, they go, damn, okay. Right? That took courage. I'm gonna do the same thing. And over time, you begin to build this emotional literacy. That's the first baseline of hope, man, is trying to fix that piece, right? So anyway, yeah.
Right there.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. My name is Sibai. I also go by Coach Sun, and I am a career counselor at Twin Cities Rise, and what we do is we empower individuals through transformative relationships. So one of the questions I had is, what I'm noticing as a career counselor is this addiction to frenzy. I see this as we work in reentry programs, people getting certificate after certificate after certificate, and I notice this underlying of transactional relationships. And so my question to you is, could you give some insight on changing transactional to transformative? And the way that we do it at Twin Cities Rise is through emotional intelligence training. So we have intense 8-week training on emotional intelligence. And so I'm interested in working with people one-on-one. Like, what are some tips you have on building the confidence in the people that this relationship isn't transactional, this is a transformative and a long-term relationship?
Yeah. Your question is how do you cultivate transformative, what are domains of transactional relationships to transformative relationships? So my thoughts about that are like, so we already have transformative relationships. You got everybody's got transformative relationships. And we have them with our parents, with our partners, our intimate partners, our children. We have those relationships. So it's not so much what do you have to do, and I can give you some examples, but most of when we get into an organization, it closes off being fully human. It closes it off. It says, you're a professional now. You shouldn't talk about, what happened at home with your kids or, and so the professionalization, sometimes the culture of professionalization doesn't allow us to be fully human with one another. And as a result of that, it defaults to transactional relationships. Transformative relationships require some sense of vulnerability. Like these are the things that you already have. Like if you're, if you're in a romantic relationship or relationship with your children or relationship, these are things that you shared something. When we all went through COVID, I guarantee you, everybody in this room, when you went through COVID, you had a breakdown moment and somebody listened to you. And you may have cried or you may have got angry, but somebody held and was there for you, right? That's transformative relationships. So in an organization, it's important first to create safety, because sometimes it ain't safe. Like, there's a black woman that told me one time, Dr. G, how do I create a transformative relationship? Everybody I work with is a white male and they don't really value me. I'm not gonna try to get vulnerable with them, right? So that's real, right? So how do you create safety first? And then second, once you have safety, then you establish some sense of trust. And trust is trust that my business won't get out there, right? Trust that there's this space that we're in is authentic and real. And thirdly, that means that the facilitator has to do more than just be the professional. That means that you have to disclose, you have some vulnerability. It's called an empathy exchange. And the empathy exchange is when I give you a piece of my humanity, it gives you a permission to give me a piece of yours, because I feel safe now. That you told me that, I feel a little bit safer now. And so you have to sort of balance your own disclosure about what feels comfortable, but it means that you have to have some courage to go beyond the boundaries that have been given to us in the MSW program or the social work program that says, because in our communities, I'm not gonna trust you until I know you, period, right? And so we have to find that right balance of disclosure and vulnerability to allow for that to transform. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks so much. My name's Erica Thorne, and there are many of us who live. There are many of us who live within blocks of the corner where the sadistic police murder of George Floyd took place, and many of us have been organizing ever since. And I want to just make clear, there are real square keepers, people who go to the square every day. And people come, and there's music, and there was always a fire going, probably for the first 3 years for sure. So the reason I'm bringing this up, so I'm one of the people that are, support a little bit from the outside. I'm not there every day. And is anybody here who is a square keeper? That's the name, a square keeper. Yeah, because they're at the square. So we have a problem, we have a contrast between problem and possibility. The problem is what the mayor and his hand-picked folks who have spent some kind of zillion of dollars on studying the problem and putting out online surveys and so forth, and I know that there are good people in that process with the mayor. The mayor, personally, I do not trust, but there are good people in it. And where the possibility is with the people who are holding down the square and have been for 4.5 years. And they're not asking the square keepers. They're not sitting there at the fire and finding out because what is now called George Floyd Square, that's where the possibility is. The possibility is around the fire at the square. And I've had to deal with this mayor and his ideas for quite a while, and I'm not a staff person or anything, I just disagree. I think he is a problem. So how do we amplify, or what are your thoughts about amplifying this rich sense of possibility and vision that is fomenting every day? at George Floyd Square as opposed to the institutional problem that they want to get rid of?
Yeah, I think this gathering right here is it, right? Like, I'm not from this community, and so that question has to come from the community, not me, right? That question has to come from the square keepers. That the response to that question is for the folks that was on the front lines that are putting it in and day out about their vision for what needs to happen in Minneapolis. And so, but I see this community, right? And so the answer to that question doesn't sit with me. I think it sits with the community about how to respond and what folks need, what vision folks need to have for what needs to happen in the city. All right.
We'll take another question, but as a historian, I got to chime in on that just a little bit. It's not that far be it from a historian to say that sites aren't important and that we don't memorialize or we should think about memorializing a particular space. But the square is much bigger. It's the people in this room. That was a failure of housing, education, access to places of public accommodation. I like to tell people the most compelling witness for me during the Chauvin trial was Alicia Euler, who was the gas station worker across the street, who dropped out of school in the 11th grade, who is the poster child for the interventions necessary to create a just and equitable Minneapolis. And so we have to think about addressing those issues and that square being much bigger than what happened on that corner. That 38th in Chicago isn't hollowed because of what happened to George Floyd. It is an opportunity for us to think about Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, Ophelia Rice from 1900. I blew Attorney General Keith Ellison's mind by telling him the story of a black woman who was beaten by the Minneapolis police in 1900 and sued successfully, and yet the echoes that Dr. Ginwright was talking about continue. Because we're very good at diagnosing the problem, but we don't get at the point that wounds produce narratives. And history doesn't repeat itself, it echoes, and those echoes are damning. This room is about muting and getting rid of those echoes, facing them in a way that doesn't allow us to then go back and say, well, like you were saying, I got this degree, I got this piece of paper, I did this process, and what the mayor did, which was problematic, said, well, now that Derek Chauvin has been convicted, problem solved. Nope. Problem was just beginning, and that's the work we have to kind of burrow into and get accustomed to doing.
That's right.
Next question, right there.
Dr. Ginwright, you started out this morning talking about the importance of spirit over policy, and I assume you put programs kind of in with policy. But we heard a lot of questions about hopelessness of youth. I think that's a huge driver of what we're seeing today, some of the increased crime amongst youth, and also the lack of relationships, ongoing relationships. We heard about that from people. Are there any programs out there, I know you travel around the US and study these things, that we should be looking at as models of how to do this or work with youth?
Ooh, that's a big question. So yes, and I'm gonna try to bang, 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 a couple of models. So one model is what I just shared with my own organization, Flourish Agenda. You could go to the website. It's Camp Akili. It's a space to provide behavioral and mental health supports for young people who have experienced all sorts of trauma. And when I say trauma, I'm not talking about acute trauma. I'm talking about environmental trauma, history, generational trauma. For 5 days, you get the young people come, and the adults that come are trained in healing-centered engagement model that I developed, which it's the camp, but then they are connected to community partners who are also trained in healing-centered engagement. So that's one. At flourishagenda.com, you could look at that, and you could actually get some tools, and I'll make sure you get some healing-centered engagement toolkit. The second example is in California, and it's also happening in Illinois, where they're creating healing-centered systems. So it's not enough to just focus on programs, but how do we align systems of behavioral health, mental health, schools, education, align those so that they're all focused on the well-being of young people. So what's happening in California is, one, there's a policy initiative to align those things, but there is also a people initiative. They're working with the leaders in that system to actually create the to have the mindset to shift those conditions. One quick change. In Medi-Cal billing, you needed to have a diagnosis. They've shifted that. You don't need a diagnosis anymore. Secondly, in order to get behavioral mental health, you had to go to the hospital or the doctor or a mental health provider. Now, you could train peer street workers that are front lines are now can get paid for mental health and behavioral health support, opening up the possibility for folks to get access to mental health. That's the second example. Healing-centered systems in California, and there's also happening in the state of Illinois. The third example, the level of behavioral mental health in this country far outweighs its delivery system for a number of reasons. We're not going to therapy our way out of the mental health crisis that young people experience. We're not going to hire enough therapists, right? It's going to take 100 years to hire enough competently trained therapists. So that means we have to reimagine the delivery system. We have to democratize access to it. Behavioral mental health needs to be in barbershops, beauty salons, schools, churches, wherever, to have mental health conversations with young people. We have to open it up, right? And so there's an amazing organization that's doing this. It's called the Confess Project. Brother is doing training barbers how to have mental health conversations with people that sit in the barber chairs. Microdoses of healing and well-being, right? Doesn't take the place of therapy and acute trauma, but if you think about reimagining those systems, there are examples out there. The community is already responding to this crisis. The systems just ain't. And so we have to actually start to take the lessons of what's happening in communities and reimagine how to actually do these systems. So that was quick, but.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nell, and I'm an organizer with New Justice Project. And I had kind of a question I've been kind of sitting on. I read your book last year, and I thought it was super insightful. I wanted to talk about identity politics. I really like that you touched on that in the book. And then something that I've seen a lot in Minneapolis and in Minnesota and the progressive movement spaces is this idea of perfection and righteousness. And I feel like that's holding us back from being able to work with working class folks and poor folks and just people, normal people in general. I think we don't have things in common with folks, especially me being Black and queer. I oftentimes, when I go into certain neighborhoods, I do get misgendered, but I'm that's just to be expected. So not in a way of oh, it doesn't matter, but of just it matters to me to organize to get this person housing more than for them to be politically correct. And so how do we move out of this space of righteousness and perfection and get people to see we do have aligned values, we're just saying it in a different way and meet people where they're at while still respecting each other's identities.
Wow, I think you just said it. You just said it. And I think this is a great response or way to close. I think you just raised a concern or a challenge in our progressive movements. And you named it sort of perfectionism or righteousness, and sort of talk a little bit about that in the book. But I end the book with something my wife said, you need to write another book about that last page you wrote, right? And I end the book with a call to the country to learn how to dance between accountability and grace. And how do we actually, we know how to really hold ourselves, systems, and people accountable, but we really don't know how to dance over to grace, right? And how do we learn how to do that fluidly so that we can hold people accountable and systems accountable and ourselves accountable when necessary, but also know when to grant grace? And that's the challenge that I think that's before us, is learning how to navigate and dance between accountability and not see grace as some sentimental weakness. But also, we also have to understand that accountability is a cage, and that our job is to learn how to fluidly go between them so that we can actually create an umbrella and a vision and a community that's united on what really matters. So thank you for that question.
And On that note, Dr. Ginwright, it has been an absolute pleasure being in dialogue with you. Just phenomenal. Thank you so much for joining us today. And another round of applause, please, for
Thank
Dr.
you.
G.